Oh, hey, I didn't notice you there. Very sneaky. If you made it this far, you've realized that we are no longer in 1080p 30 FPS land. We've graduated to 4K 60 FPS, but the GoPro battery saga does not end there, unfortunately. So real quick before we get into tonight's episode, ordered a camera with a couple of different batteries because I just have awful luck with batteries, right? And bundle shows up. Two of the batteries are not recognized by the camera. Bundle came with 3 batteries, by the way. Messaged the kind people at the fine online retailer that I purchased them from and said, hey, 2 of these batteries are not being recognized by the camera. What's the deal? And they were like, oh, they must be part of a bad batch. Return the entire bundle. So I now have to exchange everything instead of just the 2 batteries because that's how efficient we are in 2020, and we wonder why the pandemic has the entire world by the balls. On another note, we have parts. And by parts, I mean we have a new oil pan and bell housing. And that guy right there in this bag, badly deformed by the kind folks at the USPS, those are motor mounts. Guess what we're going to do tonight? First, we're going to vacuum the engine bay because it is a filthy mess. Second, I am going to move the old motor out of the way off camera because I said I was going to do that before and I didn't, and I just realized that I need to do it while I'm talking. And then we're going to try and make something fit. Hopefully not with a spanner designed for coilover adjustment, and hopefully not with a hammer, but I am going to try and bolt the trans to the motor and see if I can get some measurements taken and unbox everything. So hopefully you can hear me fine. Turns out that even though we are 6 generations beyond my old GoPro Hero 2, new ones have no compatibility with an external microphone unless you buy a fancy adapter because, again, welcome to 2020. Also rocking that MJ look, woohoo, or something like that. Primarily because I didn't want to get my grimy fingers all over the touchscreen. So first things first, we are going to drain the oil on this. Reason for draining the oil on this guy is that I put oil back in it when I was done regasketing it. So go me. As you can see, also old crappy filter on it. Didn't bother putting a new filter on it because wasn't at the point where it was going to run yet. So need to dispose of that. So as you can see here, we've got the Camaro pan that I was talking about, LS1 style pan. I'm going to go over the interior of this, but the sump is obviously in a different location. The windage tray that bolts to the bottom of the motor and the pickup are obviously in different locations, so we're going to have to modify the pickup tube. It's a pretty easy modification to do. The gasket is a mystery. Gasket is supposed to be here yesterday, but it's not, and tracking says that it's going back and forth between 2 UPS facilities, so we'll find out whenever it gets here. For that reason alone, I can't do the modification of the pickup tube tonight, which is no worry because we have months to address this before I actually get this thing in and running. But critical, obviously, because it changes the dimension of the pan, or the dimension from the bottom of the pan to the bottom of the motor by adding that nice little layer of gasket in between there. You can see that, as I mentioned, the different shape of the pans itself. Smaller sump, enough clearance for the steering rack, should be good to go. The only other thing we have to change over is the oil level sensor. I don't believe that I'll actually have this readout in the car, but critical piece for the PCM so we don't throw any codes, although I believe that it can actually turn those codes off that we're looking for. So again, we're gonna drain the fresh oil that I put in there just because I didn't want it to sit dry in this obviously humid environment. Get the pan off, get the new pan on. Obviously no gasket, but just for mock-up purposes until it gets here. Pull this off the engine stand, swap the bell housing on the T5 to the 61 bell housing, get that bolted up to the motor. Probably gonna pull the shifter off the T5 just because it's a lot easier going that way. Pull the automatic shifter out of the car, and then put the motor mounts on. and go from there. So it's that time. Cool music and fast moving pictures. Time lapse. So, we interrupt this time lapse to bring you unfortunate news. I believe I've been duped. So, as I mentioned, there's a company called Dirty Dingo. They make pretty popular LS swap mounts for the Z chassis, the S30 chassis, the 240Z, 260, 280Z, what have you. Me being a frequent purveyor of old junk, I like to do a lot of purchasing on eBay. Purchased a set, what I thought were genuine, off of eBay. Box showed up, typically packaged, or looked like how they are normally packaged. But the motor mounts are not slotted, and we've got some poor fit on them. So, starting to think that I got some knockoffs. Additionally, the other end of these motor mounts, just two plates. I mean, they look like they've been, probably laser cut and then epoxy coated. They do have a nice finish on them. I will give them that much. So the finish is nice. The quality of the welds, they are using true polyurethane bushings. I don't know if I just got crappy batch or I actually got hosed. I'm gonna have to do some more digging when I get back into the office. But either way, we're gonna have to enlarge two of the holes a little bit. Let's see if I can actually show you what's going on here. So maybe you can see it. From there it looks all right. But basically what's happening is the PCD, the bolt pattern of this, is centered to either these two holes or either these two holes, and on both sides it's short by like 1.5 millimeters on the top side of the bottom hole. I tried flipping it around a few times, and it looks like it's just an issue of maybe a missed machine. I'm sure if you're mass producing these things, I'm in industrial automation after all, there's a little bit of margin for error, especially if you're running these things by hand. And I'm sure that these guys' manufacturing is somewhere in a low cost manufacturing center. So it is what it is, but beats making them myself, I guess. But I still have to modify them, so maybe not. Anyways, back to time lapse, and wow, time lapse. We're from Michigan, don't you know? In the wintertime, I can see Russia from my house. All right, catch you back later. Okay, so before I dive into what I just did, I wanted to give a little bit of an update about the Breakout Barn itself. I've gotten some questions about the holes that are in the wall and the ceiling and the general state of things in here. This actually used to be a llama farm, like back in the day. I believe that this structure was actually built in the 1960s, the best that I can date it off of town records. And over time, the previous owner, oh, lights back. Previous owners just did not care about anything. I mean, nothing. The wiring in the main house, for example, went to replace a light receptacle or a light switch. And when I undid both screws, the thing shot out like 8 inches because there was like 2.5 feet of coiled Romex behind it. Instead of just cutting it short to where it needed to be and putting it in the box appropriately, they just spooled it up, shoved it in, sent it on its way. That maintenance trend continues through here. There were basically no attempts to stop squirrels, chipmunks, cats, raccoons. What else do we get here? Opossums. You name it, it's probably been in here, as evidenced by my ceiling and the walls and all of that. Fast forward to rewinding last week, we got a wicked windstorm, 45 to 60 mile an hour gusts, and it ended up taking off part of the roof of storage that's on the back side of this. Flash a picture up now, somewhere here. Maybe here. Somewhere. It's gonna be here. That prompted me to actually stop being lazy and get a bunch of wood. So now I have massive wood in my barn in the form of a ton of OSB sheathing, along with a ton of insulation that's out there. I will be redoing the ceiling. And with my previous discovery about the lights being that the previous owners in their previous don't give a shittery, he actually replaced all the bulbs with LEDs, which is mega cool, go you, from like 2007 or something. So the bulbs were that shitty like 2700 Kelvin K, 2700K, like warm red color, like great if you want to chillax and go to a sauna or something, and awful if you want to do anything that involves your eyes and fine detail. Also, major difference, when I swapped in the 4800K daylight bulbs, these do not have built-in resistors in them. The original bulbs did. So the fixtures themselves are actually typical fluorescent, whatever bullshit, probably 30-year-old fixtures. And the LEDs that are in there, I believe, are overheating the ballast or the igniter or the whatever is in the fixtures and causing them to turn off for a period of time, turn back on. So with all of my wood and the new roofing that I'm doing in the back and shit, I decided, screw it, we'll throw in some lights, right? So I have 12 brand new lights coming that will line this thing front to back, across the sides, everything, so I can actually have light that stays on. There's a theme here, it's improvement, right? Cool feature I just found out about. Remember all that ATF that I spilled on the ground? Well, I threw down a bunch of cardboard underneath it to soak it up because turns out that everything is closed and you can't get pig mats or oils. Oh my God, I can't think of the kitty litter crap that you throw in oil. Speedy dry. You cannot get speedy dry right now. But my barn's slab has this really cool feature where it just soaks everything up over time. So by the time that the speedy dry actually gets here, my ATF spill might be gone. Anyways, back to the car, while you're here, babble, life and bullshit. So what we have here is a pretty darn good fit. We have room for exhaust and things. We have steering column clearance. If you could see this guy in here, here's the steering column. Remember those motor mounts that I was bitching about a little bit? I believe that they're actually manufactured correctly, but like so many people do, when they engineer something, they don't think about the total process for manufacturing. What you end up with is very nicely cut, probably laser, water jet, whatever, how they do it, to the exact dimensions. And that powder coat adds just a few mil of thickness on it. And what that does is it's just enough, if your holes are precise enough, to not allow the bolts to fully thread in, right? So all I did was I run a step bit through just to take that powder coating off the inside of the holes that were machined, and I mean, they fit right to the motor. Those Dirty Dingo motor mounts, they sound great and they look great, and I'm sure they're great for people who don't care about hoods on their cars. But a lot of what I read, the reviews on them actually specify that they have a height issue, right? So most people end up cutting them down and dropping the motor lower in anyways. It turns out when you use those motor mounts, they're great. So they allow for adjustment of the motor this way, forwards and backwards, right? But the height adjustment level is fixed based on the design of the motor mounts themselves. So most people end up cutting them down, re-welding them, and dropping them into place to get the height of the motor in line with the depth adjustment. So I ordered Dirty Dingo motor mounts. I did not lie about that. But I ordered universal ones instead of Z-specific ones, and I'm happy that I did. The reason being, that intake is tall, all right? And I said that the truck intake was tall in the last video. Definitely gonna have to swap it out. Sucks that I can't use it because of how well they flow. But sometimes it just be like that. The other thing, the reason that I'm happy, is you can actually see how much clearance is left here. Oh, it just got really close. So I've got like 3 fingers. I don't know. It's probably like 2.5 inches between the truck manifold and the actual hood latch mechanism. So by switching to an LS1 or an LS7 or an LS6 or anything but an LS2 intake, I can actually nuzzle this motor much further back under this mount. That is critical because the T5 transmission is kind of short. So what I've got here is I need about 5 inches, maybe 5.5, the best that I can estimate right now, to get the shifter position right into a usable position in the trans tunnel hole. I have the space here, I have plenty of space here, and I want this motor to sit as far back, as close to the firewall as possible, while still making it easy to actually get to stuff like knock sensors and crank position sensors and all the other crap that's bolted to the back of it. And I definitely wouldn't have been able to do that with the other motor mounts. So I'm going to have to weld a plate on the bottom, which I anticipated. But the good news is that plate I can triangulate, and I can make this thing fit exactly how I want it to clear the steering shaft, so I don't have an issue there. The other great news about that is that it allows me to run the exits for my exhaust manifolds back here next to the steering coupler, down and through. And a big issue that I've seen on some of the small block 350s and the big block Chevy swaps on these cars is that people have a hell of a time with the driver's side exhaust manifold and the steering column, or the steering shaft, I should say, from the column to the steering gear, the rack and pinion in this case. I'm gonna run truck log style manifolds. Boo-hoo, the primaries are small, they don't flow that well. It's still gonna be a 300 plus horse motor with more torque than I'll ever need. So don't really care. I'll figure something out slick in the future. I've done some pretty wild stuff, like gone up and over and down and around in a Mercedes. Got a picture of that one too. Pretty dumb. Passenger side, clearance is a little bit tighter. Obviously, the motor is not centered. It's got to go about an inch that way, 1.5 inches to be centered. I've got this this nice piece of wood here because I have a ton of wood in this barn. Something's going to have to happen with the exhaust. It's definitely not going to be just a bolt-in solution, but it's definitely not as big of an issue as some of the dumb cars that I've dealt with in the past. So I'm going to pause things here for tonight. Not the end of the video. I'm going to pick back up, probably in similar outfit and whatnot. The next time I'm out here, probably tomorrow, but it's late enough that I need to call it quits. And next time I'm out here, we're going to be making some motor mounts and probably a trans mount, making sure that we can get this thing in, fit, and level, see how much space we have left for the manifold itself, and what we can make work until after this black screen. See ya. Situation report, not ideal. Pulled the intake off to make sure that I could get everything back to where I need it to be, spaced off, you know, where I'm blah, 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 all the other crap is gonna go. And what did I find? The freshly rebuilt motor that I rebuilt, I don't know, 2 months ago. stuffed a shop rag in the intake, in the throttle body, and taped up all the holes and made sure that nothing could get into it, like moisture, because that's what I was worried about. And what do we find? A whole lot of nuts, and not the good kind either. It seems that a little furry friend that I was previously yelling about made its way through the intake and turned my beloved truck intake into its nutty-filled home. So, heads are coming off. I guess we might as well do some cool stuff to the motor since we're going to have to pull it apart now. End of the day, it's still a $100 motor. I've got, I think, $60 worth of gaskets into it. So if we could build this thing for under $500, then I still think that's a win in my book. Other half of the situation report where we are right now, remember I was talking about those motor mounts and how they were going to work out great? Well, I took some more measurements, and I think it's actually going to be better if I chop them up and weld some new plates on them, which just goes to show that everything aftermarket still sucks, and that's been true for as long as I've been into cars, and I don't think that it's ever going to change. Blah blah blah. You get what you pay for. I don't know what to say. I just wish that somebody could actually mass produce something that didn't suck major everything. So, you can see here. As you can see here, I have ground away two nice little lines across the backside of these guys. What I'm going to do is I'm going to actually lop this off here and here, and then on the ends, re-weld this plate to the other side. Now the reason being is this mount structure is super beefy, which is great. It's great because it disperses the load of the engine across the entire fixture, and it allows a more even transmittal force, which means that things are more sturdy and better mounted. The downside is that if I leave them where they are on the block in the stock location, I can make it work, but the force transmittal to get around the steering column on the driver's side ends up coming in over here. So the force is coming in over here. I'd have to triangulate something into the mount to try and get a linear moment against this, and I'm just not happy with that. So what I'm effectively going to do is shift the entire center point of the structure over as close as I can without interfering with the steering column shaft, and we're going to go from there. Passenger side, nothing in the way. I'm just not happy with how it looks from an angular perspective. So trying to make this thing, trying to engineer it so that it lasts. Good news is that by pushing everything, 4 inches further back into the engine bay, I still have a serviceable amount of space behind the engine. Did some measurements, and this is going to clear. Worst case scenario, I have to massage this gently with a hammer, but it's easy enough to reinforce and reinvent. Shifter finds a hole. I've got to cut out a teeny bit on the front end of it, which again, it's pretty darn good for something so drastic. So we're gonna get to cutting and welding. Cool beans. Welcome back to the Breakout Barn, where I'm really tired, but I got on a roll and couldn't stop, and guess what? This shit's living there by itself now. That's correct. I learned some valuable lessons along the way. So definitely got hosed by the eBay seller, official eBay Dingo store, which is no longer a thing. Turns out that the motor mounts I bought were made of the finest Chinesium there was to be had. As you saw with the first ones in that time lapse, I plasma cut them. That made my life hell. It left massive inclusions in the metal, something that I've never run into. I mean, I thought that they were just 1/4-inch carbon steel plate, and they're carbon steel all right, but there's something else in there that did not like being welded once they were heated and then cooled down. Had much better success on the other side when I just used a traditional cutoff wheel and a die grinder to slice and dice them. Ended up with pretty happy results. I'm gonna turn this around and we can walk through it real quick. So it sits in there pretty nicely. It's nice and level. So obviously you can't just throw a level on top of your valley and hope that it's right when it's sitting on top of a lift, because it's sitting on top of a lift and there's no guarantee that it's level from side to side, front to back, anything like that. So everything has to be relative. So everything is check a bazillion times and then come back and hope for the best, right? So I went off of 2 locations here. I guess actually 4 locations here, but I used the radiator support, both the upper and the lower, as a point of reference, along with the center ridge of the cowl. And my reason for doing that is that over 50-ish years or whatever this thing is now, I'm too tired to do the math, everything is going to shift a little bit, right? Especially on a unibody car, especially one with no floors. So you take the approximate measurements of all 3 locations and you get a, plus or minus, probably let's call it 2 degrees, being realistic here, that the motor lives in. That is well within specification. There's honestly probably more pliability in the rubber mounts that come from the factory than in what I did here. So for those of you who have not done custom motor mounts in a car, particularly putting a motor in that doesn't belong, I'm going to give you a piece of advice right here. Always do the side with the tightest clearance first. Okay, I'm going to repeat that. Always do the side with the tightest clearance first. And the reason being is when you ensure that you create clearance for whatever components you're trying to avoid, most of the time it's the steering column, some of the time it's some piece of frame rail or frame horn or suspension mount. I don't even give a shit about you lights anymore. I cannot wait to replace them. But this thing needs to roll before I can get to all of this. So anyways, this is just the longest. This is the episode that never ends. Ta-da! It's the never-ending story. That one's for you, O'Keefe. Anyways, back to motor mounts, fulcrum points, blah, 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 whatever. So in my case, driver's side. Get this in here. It's tight. Okay? But there is a 5/16 air gap the entire way around the steering column shaft. It is a little bit tighter on the backside of the alternator, particularly the charging lug itself. It's tight, but it fits, and with the rubber boot, I'm comfortable with it. It should be good to go. I mocked up one of the exhaust manifolds, and there's plenty of space on this side, so I'm happy with that. Oil pan ended up sitting a little bit lower than I would like. Typically, I like to have maybe 3/4 of an inch, the lowest part of the frame on this car. Luckily for me, I'm adding frame rails because they're gone. They're beyond repair. So all I'm going to do is add a little bit more depth to the frame rails, and then I'll throw a skid plate underneath it. I wanted to get the motor, obviously the lower the center of gravity on the heaviest component in the car, the motor and transmission, the better the thing handles, right? It's just kind of physics 201. Motor mounted on one side, fulcrum, everything goes like this, and then you make your level adjustment from there. So you level the motor this way, this way. horizontally, transversely across the car, this way, up, down, on either side. And every motor is a factory spec. The LR4, the best that I could find published was somewhere between 3.5 and 4 degrees off center. That's the maximum amount of tolerance, and that has to do with oiling and the way that fluids flow inside the motor and air pockets in the cooling system and all sorts of crap like that. Obviously, these things aren't leaving the factory at dead nut zero, because I don't know if you guys have seen any modern cars, but the build quality is just absolute shit. So once you have the tightest motor mount done, ta-da, and I'll go over the motor mounts when I pull everything back over. I'll show you what I did to them. You move on to the passenger side. You make sure everything's level, and then you build it there. So I isolated the motor with a couple of blocks of wood, because I've got lots of wood in my barn. And a chain up top. Made sure that the transmission was centered in the tunnel. I didn't care about pitch of the transmission yet, but I made sure the transmission was centered in the tunnel, and then built out the motor mount. On this side, it was super easy to do. 3/16, 2x2 angle iron with a little bit of gusset reinforcement, and the ears out of the stock kit. Everything bolted right together, and it sits great, and it clears everything because passenger side is hunky-dory. Exhaust on this side, a little bit tighter, mostly because of the starter. So starter has to live right there. Luckily for us, since the LS is like literally put it in everything, you can get a mini high torque starter, which I've used in that goofy Mercedes that I showed actually earlier in this. So that's going to be the plan. Mini high torque starter, a little bit of an ovular pipe. Like I said, I'm running the truck style log manifolds, so I believe that the primaries, the collectors on them they're only like 2 inches. There's 2 inches there. There's a 2-inch air gap for sure. Especially because I'm not going to be running air conditioning. I left enough space that I can get heater core hoses in there. The manifold will fit. I think the truck manifold is going to fit because of the way that everything worked out. I think that I'm going to have to scallop the bottom of the hood mount a little bit, but I can triangulate between these 2 points to add strength on the sides and create clearance where I need to right here. On our way up, because transmission's underneath the car, and you guys aren't Superman and my camera doesn't have X-ray vision. Do 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 do, and we're there. So I just want to point out that no matter how much I clean the leaves out from underneath this car, it is always a filthy mess, because every time I touch something in this car, more leaves fall out of other places. So I personally cannot wait to get this thing off the lift, get all of my wood out of the way, roll this thing out, pressure wash the ever-living hell out of it now that I've got all the stuff out of it. It's just making a giant sloppy mess, and every time I clean it, something else falls out, so I just kind of put the whole cleaning thing on pause. Some questions came up about my lift that I would like to address. Yes, it is a real lift. No, it is not from the 18th century. It is a rotary lift. It's a 6,000-pound lift. It's a scissor style lift. It's a low rise, particularly because I have they're like 11-foot 9-inch ceilings here, and if I put a 2-post in, I really wouldn't get much more lift than what I have now. So I have a couple other cars, one of them being a Hyundai Genesis, a G80. And that car on the lift, there's maybe 14 inches of space between the light, which I've sucked all the way up, and the car when it's on the lift. And for that reason, my wife has an HRV. I'll change the oil on that occasionally, and there's like no space. So huge benefit to a scissor lift. You can do everything that you need to with a traditional 2-post lift or a 4-post. But when there's nothing on it, there's a ton of space for activities, right? So I can move freely here. I'm not constantly wheeling around posts. So suck it. It works for me. Don't care. The other thing is, yes, it's safe. I know it looks crusty. It's got oil all over it. I'm not at a point in my life where I have 3 hours a weekend to mow and stripe my lawn and clean everything. So it is what it be. This safety mechanism here is fantastic. It uses physics and mechanical engineering to make sure that so the weight of the car actually keeps this locked in place, and pending none of the 1-inch diameter grade bolts end up shearing, which if you look at the tensile strength of oh my God, what did I say? Grade 1? Grade 10? 1-inch diameter grade 10 bolts. If you look at the tensile strength of them, it's something like 46,000 pounds, I think, to shear them. So a significant amount of moment on those guys to make them fail. So yes, it's ugly. Yes, it works. Yes, it's safe. Anyways, transmission. And then I'm going to bed. Things I do for you people and me, because I'm an addict. This is what addicts do. Okay, so I mentioned I'm not an animal and that I was going to use polyurethane bushings. And when I mocked up I really wanted to use the stock cross member for this, mostly because it lines up really well with where the actual transmission mounts are for the T5, but also because it's the right length, it's right, it's easy to modify, and everything is hunky-dory. The downside to that is that it was significantly close to where I needed the T5 to be. So I mentioned that you set the lateral pitch of the motor to whatever the specifications are. The other critical portion of that is the actual layback of the motor. It's basically, if you look at it in an XY plane, if X is left to right across the motor, and Y is front to back, and then Z is going to be the rotational or the vertical axes in it. You need at least a 2 degree to 2.5 degree, ideally, layback on the motor itself. The problem is if you set that specifically on the motor, that means that the nose of the motor is pointed 2.5 degrees up, right? And that has to do with oil drainage, and so that things don't pool, and so that everything functions like it's supposed to. The problem is if you only set it based on the motor and you don't pay attention to the rear transmission, if you go off the front of the motor from the back of the motor or to the back of the transmission, it's probably 4 feet. It's probably close to 4 feet. So you multiply that angle off of the transmission or off the motor mounts, and you end up with a really nasty angle coming out of the back of the transmission. And when you're using U-joints in a transmission, typical specification to stay within spec on a U-joint. I'm just rambling. This is awful. I apologize. I can do a much better job of explaining this if I wasn't so tired, but I'm not coming back out here to shoot the rest of this video, so I'm doing it right now. To be within specification for a U-joint, you have to maintain a pinion angle typically between 1.5 and 2 degrees off center. Now, U-joints have to be they have to be at an angle. If you put them straight, if you have 0 degree deflection in the actual U-joint, you end up wearing the needle bearings into the casings of the U-joint, and the U-joint fails. So you need some inclination, but not too much. So it's a delicate balance, right? So take an angle gauge to the back of the transmission, you center everything, you measure off the inside of the drive shaft, you use a giant piece of steel, galvanized 1x1, which is what I did to make sure that you're going in the right direction, that everything lines up. And then you set your pinion angle. You set your angle relative to the rear pinion on the diff. So right now, the best that I can tell, I've got about 2 degrees coming off the back of the transmission, off center, in the vertical axes, and the Z's from the factory, the best that I can find for a 72 series one with an R180 is, or I guess it's a series 2, 72 S30 with an R180 is about 1.8 degrees nose up. So I fall within the range. I should be fine. Might get a little bit of premature U-joint wear, but this is also not a car I'm going to be driving 30,000 miles a year. So if I have to change a U-joint every 5 years, then that's typical maintenance stuff, and it's within my margin of error. Getting back to the transmission mount. So all I did is you can see on the side, I have a bunch of leftover polyurethane bushings just from years of doing polyurethane bushings on cars. And typically when you order a kit, you end up with a bunch of crap that you don't need. These ones are actually C-arm bushings from a 96 to 04 Grand Cherokee. What I did is I actually cut the bushing sleeve that these things ride on, and I cut it about a 1/16 of an inch short of what the bushing is itself, the polyurethane bushing. So there's a brass-plated sleeve on the interior of that's isolating and locking the bushing in place, so that all the load is not on the so the transverse load is not on the being applied to the bushing directly, and that actually gives the compliance needed so that you don't get all the MVH going right up through to the transmission tunnel, and the transmission doesn't sound like a bag of marbles right through the right into the cockpit. As far as the mount goes, pretty easy. Just another piece of 3/16 2x2 angle steel that I welded to the side of the transmission mount. I slotted the holes, and I need to find some appropriately sized hardware. I thought that they were metric because GM did a lot of that in the 80s and 90s with the T5s. Then I remembered it's Borg Warner, American company, so best I can tell, they're like 3/8/16. I don't have any bolts that are the appropriately size, that are the appropriate length, so I got to swing by the hardware store and pick up a couple of those, and probably a grade 5 or grade 8. One more thing. Jesus Christ, one more thing. As you can see, the shifter, I guess you can kind of tell. So the shifter output, again, it's a little bit further forward than what I anticipated. I am going to have to elongate that hole a little bit, but all things considered, pretty good. Drive shaft length actually matches up pretty well. So there's a company called Jags That Run, and one of the really neat things about using a T5 is that all the T5s had mechanical speedos, right? So or had mechanical speedometer gears as opposed to a digital speed output. I don't want to say all, but the one that I have does. And Jags That Run actually makes a conversion cable that slides right into a T5, threads on, and goes right up to the back of the Datsun speedometer. It's like an $80 cable, but it allows you to reuse your factory speedometer with a T5 transmission, which is really cool. So I can actually keep the factory gauges. There's another company called JCI, which I'm not sure if I'm going to use yet because his ordering system is from like actually 1996 and requires money order or cashier's checks mailed to him in advance. And he's got a really, it's really bizarre. But anyways, they make bushings, which I can pretty easily replicate, that will tap into the side of the LR4 in standard positions that I can pull coolant temp and the oil pressure. So one goes into a freeze out plug on the passenger side of the block. The other one actually goes into the, there's actually an oil takeoff on the side of the pan that's plugged from the factory, but it's easy enough, a couple of bolts and you can tap right into it. And that allows you to run the oil pressure and the coolant temperature gauges right in that dash pod, right in the middle. I also found out that there's some wiring schematics that if I add a resistor, take a resistor away, I don't remember which one, I can use the factory tack. So I can actually use all the factory stuff. It'll look really cool to have all the factory gauges working. I'm gonna have to have a little bit more monitoring. Pretty sure I'm gonna add a wideband O2. That's pretty much the only thing that's gonna be missing. Internally, I've got I might actually add a volt. I believe that this car had an ammeter, which is great for 1972, but I care about whether or not it's charging because I'm going to be using the Chevy 110 amp, actually I think it's a 140 amp alternator in place of the 1972 Datsun, most likely generator. That's it. That's it. This is the song that never ends. It goes on and on, my friend. If you made it this far, really, really appreciate you guys checking this out. This has been, I'm trying to keep this as honest of a representation as possible of what it actually takes to build one of these cars, to undertake a project like this. And please, if you have questions, if you have concerns, if you have anything, please feel free to ask. I'm talking, I'm doing a lot of rambling, but I like interacting with people. I like trying to share knowledge, and if I don't know the answer, then I want to learn it myself. So please ask questions. I finally settled on a design that I really like for the car that I'll share in a couple videos, I'm just going to keep plugging along. So next steps, next videos, motor and trans are coming back out. I'm going to be taking apart the suspension, going through bushing replacements, all that kind of stuff. I'm pretty heavily considering a 5-lug conversion, which means that I will probably be doing some milling. I have a 10-inch rotary table, so I should be able to mill the hubs pretty easily, and add a basically re-drill the PCD and add some additional studs. Wheel selection for 4x114, and what I'm looking for is kind of slim, and there's some really cool 5x114 and actually 5x120 wheels as well, that are period correct. I think would look really good on the car, but we'll get there anyways. So next step, suspension, get that all out of the way, or floors, either one, probably floors. I should really do the floors. All right, fuck it. Next step, floors, whenever I take a nap. I mean, actually go to sleep, because it is now 12:24. So again, thanks for tuning in, and Comrade Kartoshka out. I'm going sleepy night nights.